Agenda item is a public comment period. So this is generally the time for audience to speak on things not on the agenda, not regarding our public workshop. So if there's someone in the audience that does have any questions or would like to provide any comments, this is a good time. And maybe just come forward and speak.
My name is Carol Sheeran. I live in Marin. I've lived here for 46 years. And I'm wondering why you chose to have a meeting at 5 o'clock on a weekday when most of the people are in their cars commuting, trying to get home after a day at work.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sharon. Anyone else from the audience? Okay, with that.
I do.
Okay.
They said it might be answered in a while, but I was looking back here, and you're saying that that they're taking the winter water usage to determine the amount of flow versus, and the thing is right now, it looks like there's a relationship that's very fair, where you have 10 units is equal to 10 times more than a single unit. Now, she just mentioned she's in Marin, and so am I. There's 250 homes in Marin. I'd say less than 50 of them have more than 2 people in them. And yet these multi-unit places have not only the 2 people, but they have 2 kids or 3 kids or whatever they can to get more money or stay in the country or whatever it is that they always have a bunch of people staying in the place. So how can you say that they're going to use less water than a couple that's living in a home during the wintertime?
Okay, great, thank you. So the question here was very direct to the public workshop, and we will have our consultants walking us through the methodologies and the questions. I think I'd like to hold until we get time for the agenda, but thanks very much. Anything else not related to the public workshop that the audience would like to speak to? Okay, with that, we'll go to our public workshop. I'd like to introduce our general manager, Mark Williams.
We're going to go ahead and take the roll.
Okay, so sorry, as part of our regular board meetings, we go through a roll call process. So Susan McGuire is our finance manager. Susan.
Okay. President Murray.
Here.
Board Member Elias.
Here.
Board Member Clark.
Here.
Board Member Greenfield.
Present.
Board Member Shrievman.
Here.
Also present, General Manager Mark Williams, District Counsel Dave Byers, Collection System Safety Manager Janice Mandler, Plant Manager Mel Liebman, District Engineer Mike Cortez, Environmental Services Director Nina Capitanos, Personnel and Accounting Technician Nancy Turnbull, and District Treasurer Susan McGuire.
Very good, Susan. So I think at this point I'd like to introduce our general manager, Mark Williams, and Mark will describe the process and also what we've done and what's ahead of us.
Good evening. I know a lot of you have a lot of questions about sewer rates and how we came to this. A few years back, we had some of our customers come in concerned about how the methodology was calculated for our sewer charge, specifically related to apartments. And so we held off doing the study because we had a variety of projects and we were not through our last increase in rates. And so with that, we took time and evaluated where we were at and decided that we needed to really look into detail at this. But before we step into that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the district. Many of you may not know that we serve about 30 residents in our district, and we have about 105 miles of sewer pipe.
30,000, Mark.
About 30,000.
Right.
Yeah, 30,000, not 30. Yeah, if that's the case, the rates we need to work on that. But they
go to
thank you,
outhouses.
Megan. Yeah, that might be better. I don't know. We'll see. So anyhow, we have about 30 residents and 105 miles of sewer pipe. That's equivalent to driving from San Rafael to Rockland, California. That's a lot of sewer pipe to maintain. We have sewage pump stations and force mains. We have a treatment plant, and if you haven't been to our wonderful reclamation area, we have a reclamation area where people come out and they can walk around our ponds and view wildlife. We also have a recycled water facility that we built, which right now in a drought really makes a lot of sense. So with that, we do take a lot of pride in representing our customers. We're very cautious about increases. In fact, we could have increased our rates even higher. Our last 218 notice allowed that, but we've cut things out because we're trying to be conscious. And it may not seem that way to you, but if you were to look at the other sewer rates in Marin, their rates that are $1,200 a year. So we're below the average, and we have a lot of infrastructure that is old. It would be equivalent to, say, our plant being constructed in 1955, you driving a 1955 car here and driving it every day. We drive this plant every day, keeping it together, our pipes together, and it's a lot of work. And we do this to avoid environmental issues, public health issues, and also fines. You may not be aware, but there are many agencies that have been fined many millions of dollars. You guys have to pay those fines, so it's really important that we avoid that. So with that, as I mentioned, we looked at various consultants to study these rates and make sure that they're equitable and fair, and we've hired HDR, and with that, I'd like to introduce Tom Gould, and he's going to talk about the rate methodology. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, as Mark said, my name is Tom Gould, and I'm with an engineering firm called HDR Engineering. And my area of specialty or expertise is actually in utility rates. I have about 35 years of utility rate setting experience. I work around the country. I also work in Canada. I also work on water rates, electric utility rates, solid waste rates. Some of the utilities in the local area that I work with, I'm right now working with the city of Belmont, just south of the airport, San Francisco Airport, on some sewer rates. I'm working with the city of Folsom right now, Sacramento Suburban. So I have a lot of experience in California with utility rate setting. And so when we were hired to take a look at the district sewer rate methodology, I brought to the project a lot of perspective about how other utilities establish their rates and what might be called best industry practices. So my background actually is in business and finance. It's not an engineer. I'm one of the few engineers that's not an engineer at HDR. But what I wanted to do today was give you some sense of the thoroughness of which the board has reviewed this issue. We really started probably about 5 months ago or 4 months ago, at least in early November, and we've had 5 meetings. This is the 5th meeting on this particular topic. And the meetings have been fairly extensive. We've had really great public turnout for those meetings. We've had a lot of great feedback from folks, and we've tried to listen and tried to fine-tune the various options that we've looked at. At the same time, the board has asked a lot of really good hard questions, and we've tried to respond to those. And in this process, what I want to try and do is sort of go through the thought process that we use to review the district's rates and how we came down to the final recommendations. Again, nothing has been formally adopted at this point. The process is really to gain feedback from you, help you understand the board's thought process and our thought process, and see if we can move forward. So as we started to review this project, we used essentially 7 steps to come to a final recommendation. And we think we did it in a way that's very sequential, in the way that you might think about establishing rates. So the first step that we used was to review the district's existing rate structure, gain an understanding of what the district had been doing in the past, how they had established their rates. Then the next step, and this was the first meeting we had with the board, we prioritized the board's goals and objectives in establishing rates. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's a pretty important step. Understanding what's really important to you as you start to establish your rates. We also, at the same time, looked at what other California utilities do in terms of rate setting. And so there's a number of surveys out there that we took a look at. We also looked at local Bay Area utilities and how they look at their rate design practices for their sewer utilities. We then, from that process, started to think about, well, what were some of the rate design options we could look at, or the concepts and ideas that we could use. And from those concepts and ideas, we did the technical analysis, and we looked at a lot of options. So it wasn't just we picked one and we went for it. We looked at a range of options and a range of ideas and concepts. And from that, we narrowed down the various options, and I'll show you sort of how that process worked. And finally, we came down to the final board decisions or policies that need to be reviewed as part of this process. So today what I'm going to do is go through each one of these steps with you, hit the highlights, show you sort of what we've done and sort of the conclusions we came to in that process. So if you aren't familiar with the district's rates, here's a simple overview. I say simple, but this is part of the process of understanding where we are. At the top, you'll see the rate is $647 per unit per year. So on an annual basis, right now, if you're a single-family home, you'd pay $647 per year, and that's billed on your property taxes. So one of the things that's an issue here, and as Mark had mentioned, was that the multifamily customers believed there were certain inequities in the existing rates, in that a multifamily unit was being treated as the same as a single family for billing purposes. And I'll go through and talk a little bit about the logic of how you look at the consideration of how you bill your customers. But that was one of the key issues that we had. Now, also at the same time, there are various other customer classes of service. So in other words, there's residential, there's multifamily, there's also commercial, but there's another factor that the district takes into account called high strength. And high strength means that there are certain customers that send wastewater to the treatment plant, and it has a higher concentration of certain characteristics that make it more costly to treat that wastewater. So one of the things that we were asked to take a look at was the various strength factors that we were using for the commercial customers. And we've gone through and done that and taken a look at what we think are the strength characteristics and those factors. So that's the other key component of this study. Now, one of the things I talked about, so that was basically phase one, just gaining an understanding of where the district was in terms of their rates. The next step, we talked about this idea of prioritizing the board's goals and objectives for establishing the rates. And you'll see on the left-hand side, I've got the board prioritization. On the right-hand side, I've got the district's management prioritization. And when you kind of look down the list, there actually were 10 criteria that we talked about. So there were actually 10 different things, and what I tried to do was prioritize the top 5 for each one of the groups. And the board will tell you that they each independently pick their objectives, and then what we try to do is synthesize those into a set of board priorities. But you can see that the board prioritization is revenue stability and predictability, the same as the management teams. And there's a variety of reasons for that, because the district, if you look at some of the charts out here as you came in or as you leave today, you'll see that there's a number of costs that are more fixed in nature on this particular system. There's not a lot of costs that vary with the flow of the wastewater. And so that's a really important thing to think about as you start to establish your rates. So revenue stability, be able to pay those fixed costs on a monthly basis or annual basis are pretty darn important. And as we go down through these, you'll see that there's a little difference between the two groups, between what the board thinks are priorities versus what the management thinks are priorities. But ultimately, I think what's really critical for everyone to understand is that I think the board really wants to just have what they consider to be fair and equitable rates for all customers. And so that's a really important concept that we'll try and work down through and show you how we think we've come back to that and how that works out. So once we prioritize the board's goals and objectives, the next step was to really take a look at what other people do. And one of the ways that we did that, there's a wastewater user charge survey that's conducted on an annual basis. It's done by an independent state agency. And it had 422 responses last year. So when we looked at 422 utilities, what we asked ourselves is, well, what do other people do? That's one of the things that people always ask. Well, what do other people do? And so that's not the whole basis for what we're proposing here, but it gives you some context about what other people do. So we reviewed both statewide and in the Bay Area. And what you see here is a little chart that will demonstrate or show you what other people do in terms of how they bill on an annual basis, on a monthly basis, on a bi-monthly basis, and the rate structure that they use. Is it a flat rate? Is it a volumetric rate? And so let me highlight a couple of things here for you. The first is that for the residential on a statewide, the top chart is on a statewide basis, those 422 utilities. The monthly and flat rate was the number one rate structure that's used by utilities, most frequently used. The number two was the annual and a flat rate. That's similar to what the district currently does here. The number one commercial approach was to bill on a monthly basis and use a volume-based rate. And the reason for that is that most commercial customers have varying usage patterns and characteristics, so that creates an equitable rate for them. Let's flip down here to the Bay Area, and what you'll see is in the Bay Area, and I've loosely defined Bay Area here, annual and a flat rate is the most commonly used rate structure. That's exactly what the district is currently doing with their rates. It's the $647 billed on an annual basis. And the number one commercial is the annual and volume based. So you can see that the district already is pretty much in sync with what other people are doing. So that wasn't really a key issue in terms of this particular study. The key issue, again, comes down to some of these rate relationships between the various customer types. So one of the other interesting things that sort of came out of the survey, and this was even a little bit surprising to me, was that the size of the utility didn't necessarily correlate to the bill frequency or the structure that was being used. And why is that important? Well, I would have thought maybe that if you were a larger utility and you're a little bit more sophisticated, maybe you'd use a little bit more sophisticated billing structure, and that wasn't the case. In fact, it was almost the opposite of that. Some of the larger, what I consider to be more sophisticated utilities have some of the simpler rate structures. A lot of this discussion comes down to the administration of the rates and the ability to obtain consumption data to be able to bill on a volumetric basis. And that's one of the key issues that we addressed in this study. So we did do a more complete review of some of the local area utilities. It wasn't just as simple as do they bill monthly or bi-monthly and there's a flat rate. We actually went into some of the detail, and if you have a copy of the actual report that we did, you'll see there's a lot of detail in there. Most of the utilities do use a flat rate, and there is a range of treatment of this, and when I use SFR, MFR, that's single family residential or multifamily residential. There is a range of treatment out there. So what we saw in the Bay Area was that some people have rate relationships that set the multifamily as low as about 70%, all the way up to 100%, which is where you are today. So there is a range of perspectives about that particular issue. And that's one of the challenges that the board has, is to understand sort of the challenges of that there is no one single correct answer when we come down to this issue. And the strength relationships are typical of other utilities. So the district is in a pretty good position in terms of their strength relationships. So one of the basic starting points that we had was this question about the fixed versus variable costs and how that might relate to a rate structure. Because if you have a lot of variable costs, maybe then a variable type rate structure makes a lot of sense. If you have a lot of fixed costs, in other words, fixed costs don't vary based upon consumption. If you all kind of remember what a fixed cost versus a variable cost is, fixed costs don't vary with consumption. In the case of the district, about 95% of their costs are fixed in nature. So given that, when we started looking at the idea of a concept of a fixed rate versus a variable rate and moving towards more volumetric charges, it just didn't make a lot of sense. So then the question becomes, well, how do you gain that equity if we can't necessarily bill on a volumetric basis? Now, there are also other issues associated with moving towards volumetric billing for residential customers. A lot of those came down to the fact that we don't measure sewer consumption directly. There isn't a meter on your house that measures the amount of wastewater that goes out of it. And so the point that you were making earlier was we use water consumption as a reasonable surrogate to estimate what we think the wastewater use is. And we'll go through some of those numbers with you and kind of show how that works out. But ultimately what we concluded was that trying to develop volumetric rates for residential customers was too complex and too administratively burdensome. We had a long discussion about that at the second meeting. So how do we use water consumption to try and figure out how much is going out of the house in terms of wastewater? Well, the way that we typically do this is you look at wintertime water consumption. And there's a basic assumption built into looking at wintertime water consumption, and that is that the vast majority of that consumption is probably what we call indoor use, meaning that for all the gallons that are coming in, there's probably some proportion that's going out, and it's indoor use. So in the case of the district, and again, we have this issue of we have to get the consumption data from another entity, another water district, to be able to take a look at these measurements. So what the district looks at is basically the mid-December through mid-February is the time period that they assume is the measurement for each customer's wintertime water use or indoor use consumption. And so what we discovered, and this kind of comes back to the points that we talked about on the administrative issues, was that we found it a little bit challenging at times to work with another entity's data, make sure it all lines up with the accounts that we have on the sewer side and so forth. And so ultimately we came down to the conclusion that it wasn't easy to cross-reference some of this data. Using volumetric approaches is pretty challenging. So it still provides us though with the basis of what we think people are contributing to the system. And so there was some analysis that we did. We didn't just look at a few residential accounts, we looked at all the residential accounts. And we discovered a few things. You'll see a top graph here, and the top graph compares what is the average use per living unit for a single family home versus a duplex versus 3 or 4 units versus multiple units. And what you'll see is that the single family average is roughly it's higher, but the multifamily or the duplex, triplex, so forth is about somewhere between 70 to 80% of what a single family house has. And this is an average. So if you want to look at individual homes, there's going to be some that are higher, there's going to be some that are lower. This is kind of coming back to your point. But on average, this is where we believe the averages are. Now again, these will change also from year to year. So trying to say that this is the exact number that a duplex uses is difficult. So the challenge from the district's perspective is to try and come back to what we think is a reasonable surrogate of how these customer groups behave over time or how they consume over the long term. The bottom graph shows you a comparison of the consumption per month for residential customers. And you can see over this 2-month period, there are some customers that have low consumption. There are some that have high consumption. In fact, there were a few customers that had exceedingly high consumption. And so it started to raise some questions about how we would use this data and how the averages would be calculated. So we tried to clean up some of the data. We found that there were in some of the water consumption data, customers that had leakage problems. And so we tried to scrub the data and clean out for those particular kinds of issues. But again, it shows you that there's some issues associated with trying to come back with exact numbers, exact data. And so what we're trying to work with is what's a reasonable range that we would potentially use for this. So the vast majority of the residential customers use 10 CCF. Now, if you're not familiar with what a CCF is, it's 100 cubic feet of water, which is roughly about 750 gallons of water. So what that means is most residential customers use about 7,500 gallons of water per month on average or less.
Were those all just Lucas Valley Sanitary District people?
Yes, yes. This is just district-specific folks. We also looked at the 2-year period. This is just 1 year of the 2 years we looked at. Glad you asked that question. It spurred my memory here a little bit, and in fact, that's the first bullet. So this is just one. If you look at the second year, it's very comparable. It looks very similar. So that's the way we looked at it.
Could you explain what the bottom graph is? I don't get it.
Yeah, okay. So the bottom graph is basically trying to say that if you look at residential consumption, and I'm sorry that it's a little bit small, but you see where it comes up to the highest point on the left-hand side?
I don't understand what the columns are on each side. One
Okay.
is the number of customers, is that right?
Yes, the number of customers is on the left-hand side. So if you're looking at the blue bars, what that basically means is that for 5 CCF, in other words, for customers using 500 cubic feet of water, there's about 1,000 customers during that time period. But the red bar is cumulative. So ultimately, we try and go from 0% to 100% of the customers, and that's on the far right-hand side. So what we're saying is that when you get to 10 CCF, and I wish this had a little pointer thing, maybe not the pointer. Here's the pointer. So if you're, let's say at 10 CCF, what this is saying is 10 customers at 10 CCF, there's roughly about 85% of the customers use less than 10 CCF of water. So this is the sum of all the customers put together. Ultimately, we get to 100%. So this gives you some sense as you look at this curve and you use, let's say, 10 CCF or less, that captures about 8,500 or 85% of the total residential customers. Yes.
Could you explain, first of all, I'm not sure what the district encompasses. And then secondly, we don't have a lot of apartments, so I'm wondering how many units you have over there to the right. We're mostly single family.
Well, so this bottom chart is all just strictly single-family residential as you captured it in 2012.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Actually, we have about 2,500 multifamily units within the district. We have about 9,000, a little under 10,000 parcels, and we have approximately 2,500 that would be considered multifamily apartments, condominiums, duplexes, triplexes. We have quite a few.
2,500 living units.
Living units, yeah.
okay, and so the district, what is a rough?
4903. Yeah, the whole 94930.
A little bit in Nevada.
Okay.
From Portisquala Hill to Marinwood.
Okay, yeah.
So you have 10,000 living units and 2,500 of those are in a multifamily, multi-unit situation?
We have 9,800 parcels, and which includes commercial, residential.
Oh, okay.
And then
Do you have just residential?
Yes.
I mean, could you have a number for just residential?
single-family residential, I believe, is around 6,000.
Okay.
And one other question, how are condominiums treated?
Under this scenario, they would be treated as multifamily. The new, going forward, right now, they're currently treated as single-family homes.
Yeah.
So you say you have 6,000 residential units,
Single-family,
single family, and 2,500,
multifamily.
and so 6,000 people, 6,000 customers are going to take over covering reduction in fees of 2,500 living units,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right, okay, so it's not even 3 to 1.
Well,
Each
this-
family is going to cover about.
So let me keep going through
Okay.
the.
Well, my
Well,
question,
hold on.
I
So
have a
let-
question that's relative to this.
Okay.
Did you do the same graph for the multifamily?
No, we did not.
That would be an interesting observation.
Okay, but we didn't. That's the answer. So,
Okay. That's
Okay.
all I-
okay, I want to.
One other question, you're talking about heavy, I forget how you termed it,
Right.
strong usage.
Oh.
That doesn't mean anything to me.
So
I'm
that's a commercial concept.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
not related to the residential customers.
that would be, okay, so
Yeah.
manufacturing, that'd be heavy metals.
Right.
So we don't have a lot of manufacturing, so that's
Right.
really kind of
But
a,
you have restaurants, and restaurants have fats and oils and greases, which is more concentrated than, as an example, a residential customer.
right, okay.
So let me try and work through this, and then,
All right,
yeah, because
just trying to understand what you're doing as
yeah,
it goes
I
along.
appreciate that, okay? So let's try and work through this, and then we can come back and take questions. So, as we started to develop the rate options, we started thinking about concepts and ideas about how to move forward. And so the first was, that we needed to think about the rate structure. And we talked about this idea of a volumetric rate and so forth, and the board really came to the conclusion that maintaining the existing rate structure made a lot of sense. And what that means is maintaining that flat per unit rate, but we can change the relationships between the various customers and how we assess that rate. And that's what the second bullet really talks about, is to adjust the rate relationship between residential and multifamily to some X percent of the single family rate. So in other words, if you assume that a multifamily unit contributes 80% of what a single family unit does, then let's set the rate at 80%. And that's ultimately what this whole discussion is about, is does a multifamily unit customer contribute less wastewater on a volumetric flow basis than a single family residential customer? And the data would suggest that it does. The other thing we talked about was to adjust or revise the definition of a sewer unit to 8 CCF per month. That doesn't impact the residential or the multifamily customers. It does have an impact upon the commercial customers. And the reason why it has an impact upon the commercial customers is prior to this, it was defined as 10 CCF. The 8 CCF is related to the amount of capacity that they purchased in the system. So as they purchased capacity, they were given 200 gallons per day of capacity. That equates to 8 CCF. So that's a minor adjustment that we've made. It has no impact on residential or commercial customers. So the district and the board went through and reviewed a number of different options. We looked at the fixed and the volumetric rates. We didn't exactly throw those aside out of the chute, but we did take a look at the volumetric rates. And we looked also at a range of relationships between single and multifamily. And the reason for looking at the range, we looked at everything from 70 up to 90% in terms of the range, is because it isn't a set defined number. We know that when looking at the data, it varies from year to year. And so the question becomes, what's the reasonable range? And when you look at other Bay Area utilities, 70 to 90% is pretty much the reasonable range that you'll find. And so that's how we came back and tried to define the equivalent residential unit. We did receive a lot of public comment on this. So as we worked through this, we had a couple of meetings that lasted 2 hours on this particular topic. So this isn't the first time we've sort of rolled this out. And there was a lot of support for this differential between residential and multifamily. There is a sense with a lot of the customers, particularly the multifamily obviously, that some differential is an appropriate equity adjustment. So, you know, we have helped the district through this process. We've also done a detailed review of the definition of what's a multi-unit and who qualifies for that particular rate schedule. So ultimately, the final recommendations are the ones that you got in your little notice. I suspect a lot of you probably saw this and have looked at it. But let me give you a sense of what this means. So up on the left-hand, or on the right-hand side here is the rate, and here's the residential, here's multifamily and commercial. And you'll see again, it has maintained that per unit charge approach that we currently have in place for the district. It will still be an annual bill, it'll still be billed under property taxes. But I think you all understand the concept that if we provide a lower rate for the multifamily, then the residential will have to go up a little bit. And so the differential that the board has come down to is establishing a differential of 80%. So this rate for multifamily is 80% of the single family rate. And the presumption is that on average, a multifamily unit contributes about 80% of the wastewater flow that a single family unit provides. And that's the basis. Now what happens is, this is a revenue, what we call revenue neutral. The district is not trying to collect any additional revenue, but they're in essence redistributing the revenue, the existing revenue, or rates between the customers.
Taking it out of our pockets.
Well, so think about it from this perspective. If you believe that the multifamily should have some differential, what that means is multifamily has been subsidizing the residential in the past. You may not buy into that, but that's one perspective.
That's why there should be definitive data and not perceived data.
There will not be definitive data on this topic. It's unfortunate. If you had definitive data, you would have a meter coming out of everyone's home that measures the exact amount of contribution from everyone's home. We don't have that. So as you establish rates, you need to use the best available data. We've used the best available data. It suggests that there is a differential between the customer groups. This is not a relationship that is unusual. We've also looked at industry data, and industry data also would suggest that there is some differential between the contributions of a multifamily customer and a single family residential. Now, let's just talk about the impacts just for a second so people understand this. So the $647 is the existing rate, so you can see that it's $647. The increase will be to about $675 if the board adopts this. This has not been adopted, it's still open for discussion. And in this particular case, the increase is roughly equal to $2.33 per month for a residential customer. So it is an increase to the residential customers, let's be honest about that. But what it's doing is, it's creating equity that we believe should occur between residential and multi-unit customers. You'll also see that the commercial customers will see a slight increase also, because the unit costs are shared between residential and multi-unit customers, and also by the redefinition of the unit of an ERU from 10 CCF to 8 CCF. And so hopefully we've tried to be as clear as we can about what the impacts are to customers and at various levels of usage. This is the board's preferred option at this point in time, and again, the board has had a lot of discussion around this. And the other thing, so that sort of is how we got to the multi-unit discussion. There were some other items that we went through. I've highlighted a couple of things here. On the mobile home parks, I've highlighted in yellow. There was a question about how we treated that, and when we looked at the consumption data, it appeared to be that the relationship was appropriate. We wanted to maintain it at the current level. On rooming homes, we wanted to eliminate that category. Rooming houses is sort of a term, I think, from the 30s or 40s maybe, and so we decided that we would essentially eliminate that category, and if the district wants to create a category called accessory dwelling units, that's probably a little more appropriate. And then on hotels, motels, we wanted to eliminate those and simply move those to the commercial customers. That probably makes sense. And other than that, everything else is maintained at the existing levels. This is a little off, a little skewed. These three arrows should be related to this green area. But what you'll see is that we adjusted some of the strength factors, and ultimately the strength factors are over here. So what it basically means is that for restaurants and cafes, the strength factor was lowered a little bit. For bakeries, it was raised a little bit. For mortuaries, I don't even know if you have a mortuary, I don't think you do, it's reduced down. So there wasn't a whole lot of changes to the strength factors, and again, that's just related to commercial high-strength customers. So with that, I'd be glad to try and answer any of the questions that you have. I know there's probably going to be a lot. So let me just stop and see if the board has any questions and see if this is the forum that you want to use. I know that we wanted to try and capture questions from the audience, and we had little cards that people could write down questions. Ultimately, what we want to do is post these questions on the district's website so other people can see the questions that you've asked and some of the things that we've tried to respond to. So if you can do that, that would be great. So let me check with the board, see what you would like to do in terms of if there's any questions from the board, or if you'd like to make some comments before we take questions, or the process that you'd like to follow.
Just one comment. I have to make comments. All of us here on the board live in single-family dwellings. So for us to raise our rates is not personally comfortable. Also, when it comes to flow-based, would really serve me beautifully because I use 1.5 CCFs a month, not 10. So, you know, this doesn't personally serve me, this rate structure, or anyone on the board. I just wanted to make that very clear. So we're trying to be fair.
Well, I just have one thing while you're getting your questions together, is that on that one that I asked you earlier, did you do a chart like that?
For multifamily.
For the multifamily?
Yes.
And I think if you go and do that on the multifamilies, you'd probably find something skewed just about the same way.
Probably so.
Okay.
That there's going to be some multifamily that are less than average, some
Right.
that are greater than average. That's by definition what an average is. There's
Right.
some that are above, some that are below, okay?
So therefore, I'm not objecting to an increase. In fact, I would be glad to pay the $28 a year, the increase, because I think it needs to fix up things there. But I think the multifamily ones should not be decreased, because they are using it, and I think we find out just about as much. And so I don't think it's fair to us, as other people are saying, for us to pay for them. I don't mind paying extra.
Right.
Okay, but I don't feel that to go and reduce theirs and have us pay for that. I don't believe it.
So let me just clarify and see if I can understand what your comment is. So your preference would be to leave things the way they are and just gradually increase the residential over time to create the differential?
But why should there be a rate differential?
Well, because the data suggests, and it clearly shows, that there is a differential in the amount of volume that's contributed by a multifamily.
You only showed one graph. You didn't show two.
Well,
Your
we have
data's
2
not
years-
definitive.
We have 2 years of data that show the same.
Single family only.
On single family and multifamily averages. What you asked me is, did I create that same graph, the bottom graph, that shows the distribution? I did not. I have averages for the class for the 2 years. And in both years, the averages are roughly the same in terms of the differential between customers. At the same time, there's clearly industry data that suggests that that is not an anomaly, that there is support within industry literature for some differential between residential and multifamily. And the California Survey of Utilities clearly also indicates that utilities, for the most part, do take a look at that and consider a differential between single family and multifamily. So I'm just saying that because the point that's being made in the back is you don't have exact, precise data. And so you work with the data that you have available, and you also fill in those gaps with information and data that you know about best practices and about what the industry looks like. Yeah.
So the question that I wrote
So
was,
let me just stop. And I'm not sure if I answered your question. If I didn't, I apologize. But
I would like to see where there's this differential, okay, with those homes.
Okay.
Okay, and because I don't think there is. All right, only just because in Marin County, it's become almost a retirement community. So you're only having 2 people in a house. So if you have a certain amount of you're using the water in the winter. I mean, like I'm down to 6 cubic feet each month. No, for the 2-month period. Okay, and you know darn well that the the multifamily with 2 or 3 kids or whatever, how many they have, are using way more than that. Just because of showers and more dishes and more clothes. Well, they have to go out and do their clothes someplace. Okay, so they're causing all that, and I think that's a very important thing that you got to take a look at.
Yeah, and again, we looked at class averages, how the data was collected and accumulated, and when you look at the class averages, again, there's going to be some that are high, some are low. You obviously sound like you're lower, but on average, that's where we're at. So,
do you know what the cost per housing unit would be to implement monitoring systems? How much
monitoring of what?
To implement metering?
To actually measure the amount of wastewater coming out?
Yeah.
I've never seen one.
It's not possible.
Yeah.
The water meter is dealing with clean water, and when you turn on your shower, that water flows automatically through an accurate flow meter. The problem with wastewater is you're adding toilet paper and other things, and it plugs up. And so any type of restriction or type of flow meter that you could use would not work to measure that small amount of flow. It's just not possible. Beyond that, if you even did have that type of technology, it would cost you a lot of money to install it, and then you would have to have people read it. So then you're starting to add staff. When you start adding employees, that's where things start getting expensive. So, you know, one of the things that Tom's talked about is that we bill you via the tax bill. That's $2, what is it, $2 per household to bill you that way. If we were to have collection services, we would have to mail, and it would be exponentially much more expensive. So just back to your question, it is impossible to measure. We struggle with measuring wastewater flow at larger volumes. It would be impossible to do it for each house. And
just to give you some sense, like on your water meter, a water meter typically is about $100 to $150 per meter to install, or to just the capital cost, and then to install it. By the time you get all done, it may be $400 to $500 for just the water meter, as an example. But there is no technology, as far as I know, that would measure that.
So my point to that is that, you know, as single-family homeowners, most of us are looking at an increased cost of $135 per year. So, you know, when you extrapolate that, forever.
Not that high.
It-
Not
it's
that high.
$28.
Okay.
100 well, compared to I'm talking about the difference between 540 for multifamily compared to 675 for single family homeowners. I'm talking about that difference.
But there's more single-family homeowners than there are multifamily, so it's going to cover, each home isn't gonna have to cover each decrease. However, it's
Yes.
certainly gonna be more than $24 a year.
You've got it.
Yeah.
One of the things you haven't talked about is, let's say that you have a 5-bedroom home and you have one person that's living in there. However, in December, you are gonna have your family come home for a day and you're gonna have a big meal. That capacity has to be sitting there waiting to treat, both convey, pump, and treat that sewage. So you may say, well, I only have one person the majority of the time. However, if you have a party or if you have family come that one day, we have to be there ready to treat that sewage. And it's a capacity issue. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so there's kind of two parts to the discussion. There's a flow component, and the flow basically says, well, how much is coming out of the house?
Yeah.
And again, that's what we've been talking about up to this point, is this average, what we think on average comes out of a typical residential home versus a typical multifamily. Just a second, I'll get to you. I won't forget about you. And then there's this second part about sizing of facilities. So when you get ready to build a wastewater treatment plant, one of the challenges is, how big do you build that thing? So do you make it, 2 million gallons, 5 million gallons, 10 million gallons? It's all based upon what we think a customer will contribute to the system. Because we don't know if an apartment's going to be occupied or have 2 people in it, 1 person, 10 people, who knows? Ultimately, what we do is we design around capacity requirements that a typical customer will provide on the system. And that's what this 200 gallons per unit is about. So ultimately, the challenge that we have as a district is to work essentially with customer groups, customer classes of service, and to try to break customer groups into reasonable segments that reflect both the usage characteristics of that customer group, like residential versus multifamily versus commercial, along with the facility requirements needed to serve those customers. So I think that kind of comes back to the point that Mark is trying to make, but ultimately what we're trying to do is group customers into similar groups of characteristics based upon flow and based upon what we think their facility requirements are. So let me come back to this woman first because she jumped in there. Yeah.
I live in a single-family residence, and I own a triplex. And what I know, as I pay the water bills of both places, is that month in and month out, year in and year out, the triplex uses less water than I do. And I sat down and I thought, well, why is this? Because my tenants wash clothes, they're not dirty, they wash dishes, they flush toilets, they do all the same things I do, but there's a lot more of them, and yet their water usage is less. And the only difference that I can think of or find is that I support landscaping my water, and my tenants do not. And my sneaking suspicion is that most of the multi-unit buildings are built out lot line to lot line with garages and driveways and patios and minimal landscaping compared to single-family residences. And I think the difference that you're seeing has to do with landscape watering, and that does not go into sewers.
And you're exactly right.
Not ever.
So you're exactly right that outdoor irrigation does go into sewers, but that's one of the reasons why we look at the winter water use.
In
So-
the winter, it's the same thing. My tenants use less than I do.
Well, so the point is that when we do look at winter water use, we are trying to eliminate as much of that outdoor use as we possibly can. So when you look at that little chart I had, it shows you have a lot of high outdoor use in the summertime. That's why water bills are so high. And so we're trying to capture in the wintertime that indoor use. And we know it's not perfect, okay? We know absolutely that there probably are some people that are watering outside in the wintertime depending upon what the weather is. But that's the thing about looking at it from year to year to year, is to make sure that those relationships seem reasonable as you go over time. And I'm sure we all have stories that we can relate to about somebody that lives by themselves or somebody that knows about an apartment where there's 5 people living. But the reality is that that's not how the district wants to look at their rates. They don't want to go from apartment to apartment, looking at how many people are living in a particular unit. And so that's the challenge that the board and the administration have in terms of trying to come back to a rate that they think is fair and equitable. So I probably talked longer about this issue than you probably wanted to hear, but I want to make clear that we are trying our best to eliminate or scrub out that irrigation use when we are looking at these averages. Yes.
Okay, so a couple things that your study did not look at. You're probably aware that there were 3 priority development areas identified, at least 3, for the 94930 area. And they can have anywhere from 1,400 to 7,500 living units in each one. And that's on the horizon. It hasn't happened yet. We also have a housing element which has put designations, nonprofit affordable housing designations within the district. They will not be paying to hook up. I don't think that's part of the deal.
That's untrue.
But at the same rate as commercial? They don't get any discounts at all?
Well, they will pay the connection fee, the standard, and we didn't talk about the connection fee at all. I don't know if you want to talk about
Well, okay, so I'm anticipating that will affect the plant requirements as well, and sewer connections and what have you. I don't know.
Sure, there is an additional add to that, but if you look at it from another perspective, there are more customers that actually can spread the overall O&M costs, so it actually benefits you to actually have more ratepayers, even though they may be of this different class.
Well, but it's taxpayer subsidized. They're shoving
No,
off.
it isn't taxpayer subsidized. Right now, affordable housing pays the same rate as every homeowner pays.
Correct. That's my understanding.
Rotary Village on Lucas Valley Road, and I forget how many units are in there. I have talked to the county assessor, and the county assessor says their annual property tax, everything on that piece of paper, is $51,000. 95% of that is your sewage fee. They are paying the base property tax of one parcel, and they are paying however number units they are times the 600 and some dollars. And I got that information from Craig Miller. Is that who it is?
It's true, yes.
Yes.
Okay, well,
But then also, are they going to be considered multifamily units, so they'll be going down?
I presume they will be.
Right.
When you talk about specific parcels or pieces of property, I'm not quite at that, me personally, at that level, so.
Well, I recognize what you're saying, but actually what I'm saying is just to get the plant connected to the, to the housing unit, there's a cost, right? And it'd be 2 different costs. If you're a nonprofit, you get a special deal.
There is no special supplement for nonprofit, but so.
As far as you're concerned, but.
No, period.
Well, but the county may have their own
They may
rules.
have
The
their own thing.
taxes,
We can't
the
control
taxes
the
they
county.
don't have to pay. It's
No,
the
they'll have to
water.
pay the taxes
They
too.
only have to
I-
pay for the taxes that we voted in. They don't have to pay those that are just automatically done.
So
I
you
talked
have-
to
They pay
So you have
sewers.
initial construction, and so when they do that, whoever is building that project has to put in facilities, which the district will accept once they're completed, but that's at their cost. And then there is a capacity fee paid on top of that. Now, there is a component where the capacity fee will be lower. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's still, what's that?
Maybe 80% of it.
It'd be 80% of the current $6,200.
Okay, so the essential point I want to point out is you said the fixed costs are going to increase with all this growth. And the fixed cost all this growth is going to be in multifamily apartments. So to give them a deal doesn't really quite make sense. I live in a house that was built in the 50s. It's been paying for the plant, for 60 years. So,
Just to clarify, I'm not sure I ever said the fixed costs were gonna go up.
well,
You said that.
okay, what I am saying that. I'm saying that because there'll be more growth in the district, and
Right.
so the fixed costs have got to go up,
Yeah.
correct? I mean, that's just logic.
Well, fixed costs are related to the existing facilities that are in place today, the existing personnel that we have. That's the point of, if you add additional customers, can you service them with the existing capacity that you have? And
Sure.
maintain within your existing costs, or do you need to expand it? And the idea of those capacity fees is that as you have to expand the plant, the capacity fees should pay for the expansion of that plant. So that's the idea of those capacity fees. It should be growth paying for growth.
Okay, but isn't there a point where marginal growth, and then all of a sudden, boom, we got a brand
Yeah, there is some
new, we
point
got
when you run out
a
of
brand new
capacity.
plant,
There is a point when you run
and
out
then
of capacity.
bonds go to the
Right.
taxpayer, and the nonprofits get the ride.
But those fees that they're paying actually go toward that, so that's actually a benefit to you, that, you know, these fees are gonna go toward plant expansions and capacity projects.
Well, help me if I understand this, because if you were to build a brand-new plant, wouldn't you float a bond issue?
We can get a bond or loans, there's a variety of different ways that we.
Okay,
pay for that.
but that would be paid separate from the ratepayers, no?
No.
Okay, so
We
it's,
pay for that.
okay, well, that makes sense.
So let me just do this for a second. This side of the room has had a lot of questions. I want to go to the other side of the room just for a second. Yeah, well, I just want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity here to say or ask whatever they want to ask. So is there any questions?
I also have 8 cards I'd like
Okay.
to address too. So
Okay.
hang up there with me. I'm definitely good.
Okay. Okay, any comments, questions on that side of the room? Okay. So if you want to go to your questions now or take another question?
I just have a general question. You commented that you have had, this is your 5th meeting,
Yes,
and you've had 4 previous meetings,
correct.
and you've had a great turnout.
Yes.
Do you have a great turnout today?
I think it's comparable to what we've had in the past.
I wouldn't say 15 people is a great turnout. So I just,
Well, let me put it this way. I think we got a lot of really good feedback. I mean, I work in a lot of agencies where nobody shows up. And so when I see 20 people in a room, that to me is a good turnout. I know what you're saying. I know exactly what you're saying. You'd rather see 100 people here, and that's fine. And we can get a variety of opinions, I'm sure. But so that's my comment. I think we had feedback from certain customers, and that helped shape some of the decisions that you saw us talk about today.
The last meeting, they were all apartment owners. I was the only resident showing the whole place.
That would have been, I think, the 3rd meeting. Is that
I think
probably? Yeah.
There's 60,000 people that live here in the district.
Yes.
The district
most
is
of our
30,000.
community.
We have 30.
30,000? Okay.
Okay.
So, excuse me, folks, some of the questions, yeah, if you'd hand them off to Susan or Nancy in the back there. Some are kind of comparable. We also have about 3 per card, so it's not just one per card. Some are more basic, informational. You know, what is this? And so I think kind of looking at the structure of things, I think we'll start with that are very informational. And we attended some of our prior sessions too. A lot of this was discussed in terms of what is a single family. So let me go to that one. Well, first of all, I'll kind of dispatch this one. What would be the cost per housing unit to implement metering systems? I think Mark Williams already answered that one. And then let's see, this one I think we could kind of quickly address too. Who repairs realigned water lines? I Euphrates break last Tuesday, MMWD exclamation. Mark Williams.
That sounds like a water main break, and that would be MMWD.
Okay, thanks. And I know we're always interested in our lines in the field. You know, we've had some issues at Lucas Valley with some erosion of areas near Miller Creek. So if any time you have any issues or you see something, you're always welcome to call Janice Mandler in the back. Janice, you wave your hand. She is our collections person, so when you call in, that's who you'll be speaking with, and that's all her crews you see out in the field. Okay, so questions. What constitutes the definition of single family and what is a multifamily?
Yeah, there is a specific definition. I don't have it memorized off the top of my head, but that was actually a discussion that was had at the last board meeting. And actually one of my associates, Sean Korn, did that presentation. But the board has gone through and looked at developing a specific definition for single family versus multifamily. And help me, Susan, but multifamily, what we concluded was single family was including duplexes and triplexes.
Yes.
And anything over triplex is a multifamily. And if it's master metered,
It's multifamily.
it's multifamily. So we have a very clear definition, but that's the best I can do off the top of my head from memory, okay?
Okay, the second question is, what is the rate for a multifamily condominium complex per unit versus individual condo on its own parcel?
Well, at the current time, it's $647 per unit, regardless of whether it's master metered or individually metered. They're all treated as single family units. So that's part of the issue in the discussion in this study.
Okay, multifamily complexes can have pools, large common areas, etc. Why the 80% factor for them?
Yeah, and again, I think that question comes back to the issue about why we're looking at wintertime water consumption. And we're trying to eliminate those issues about swimming pools and landscape irrigation and so forth. So ultimately, when we look at the wintertime water consumption, we've tried to take that particular piece out. That's why we have that differential in part.
And also, large condominium complexes, if they have pools, they're more likely to have a standalone meter for that purpose, that we would not get the water usage.
And outdoor irrigation use, yeah. Yeah, so there are certain customers that have a separate and distinct water meter for irrigation use, and that for purposes of billing for sewer is ignored.
Is that typical with large commercial facilities that they would meter their landscaping water?
I won't say typical, but for a lot of utilities, and particularly the state in terms of water conservation, is trying to encourage people to get these irrigation customers to separately meter and have a separate and distinct rate for them. So,
well, that would explain a lot of the differential right there. I mean, right? I mean,
well,
if you're
so there aren't a whole lot of irrigation meters. That doesn't mean that every commercial customer has an irrigation meter. It is a practice for some customers and for some customers, but it's not the universal way that it's
I'm a little uncomfortable with the vague way you're describing things in generalities. It doesn't feel really like it's solid data, and I'm uncomfortable because basically what you're doing is you're taking one class of customers, increasing their cost, and another class of customers and decreasing their cost. And we're looking at a lot of growth from these multifamily homes. So, I mean, in the long run, we're extra something.
So here's the dilemma that I have. You asked me a question, does every commercial customer essentially have an irrigation meter?
Yeah.
I reply, no, they don't. There
Okay.
are some that do. Off the top of my head, if you ask me how many of those customers have irrigation meters, I couldn't tell you, okay? So I have to try and answer the questions as best as I can with the information that I have sort of packed away in my head. And so if I'm a little bit vague, I apologize. That's not the intent. The intent here isn't to be vague, but it is to try and give you the best information that we have available.
Well, your judgment's based on the correlation of water use to living units. And so we're kind of questioning that relationship.
That's fine.
In your average, did you take in consideration?
By the number of
any
toilets.
them with,
Hold on. Please ask your question again.
Did you take in consideration of any of them that had the separate meters?
Yes. So the separate meters are eliminated from the district's water data. So that's not That's not included.
No, but you took their other meter,
The
which
domestic
was
use.
wrong because they had a separate irrigation.
No, for purposes of calculating what we think goes back into the wastewater system, there's a domestic
but
water
that-
meter and there's an irrigation meter. When we throw out the irrigation water use, that's not included, it's just the domestic use.
But you didn't do that for us.
You-
Even though we don't have a separate meter, you charge us for the same water.
But I'm trying to capture winter time water
But we
consumption.
water in the winter.
I know that there is some wintertime outdoor water consumption that occurs. I understand that. But we've tried our best to scrub it out of the data. And there would also be, that would also occur within commercial customers that don't have irrigation meters. So we're trying to do our best in terms of creating apples to apples in terms of the comparison and creating the ratios.
Okay, I wanted to get through the other questions here too, but also wanted to let everyone know that this process doesn't stop just today. So we will continue on. And matter of fact, our attorney is Dave Byers. Dave, do you want to speak to kind of what's ahead of us? So you're participating today. You can also send emails to the district if you have additional questions you'd like posted on the district's website as Q&A. So if there's something you missed today, then we could address that.
Thank you. I have a cold, so. The board isn't making any decisions today. Okay, the purpose of this hearing is to give the residents an opportunity to see the methodology that we've obtained from the consultant. Okay. So what we will be doing, and it says on your this little handout, the actual date that the board would be making a decision on the rate is June 5th. Okay. And the board prior to that is going to look at all the data, listen to what ratepayers are saying at this meeting, other meetings, and giving the staff direction based on this input as to how the rate should be set. Now, one thing I want to stress, it used to be, and I've been doing this long enough that I can use that phrase, it used to be. It used to be that the board had essentially unlimited discretion to set the rates. That isn't how it is now. Proposition 218 tells sewer agencies and other agencies that their rates have to be based on the best data that they have so that one group is not subsidizing another group. So that's why we've never had as extensive of a sewer rate methodology consultant report as we have at this time. So the rates are basically data driven, and we rely on our consultant to give us this rates. Obviously, we also rely on the ratepayers to give us testimony. So nothing's cast in stone right now, but the board will be making a decision on this, and the decision will be June 5th. And just one point I want to clarify: there isn't any subsidy for any particular user per se. For example, affordable housing might get a subsidy from the county or a city with regards to permits. We can't discriminate on any rate. We don't have a senior rate. We don't have an affordable housing rate. Our rates are strictly data driven based on basically the amassed data here, because we don't have precision inherent in measuring your sewer usage because we don't have a sewer meter. So, we've hired a consultant, and they've looked at the data, they've looked at the industry data. That's the data they've given us, and that's how the board will make a decision.
Sorry, any questions for Dave Byers? Okay.
Well, I'm just, because you're making the correlation, you're making a mathematical correlation. I really, I had statistics in college, and the correlation is everything. How strong is this correlation between water use and sewage use and future needs created by multifamily housing? That's really to me, that's really where the big expense is going to be, is as we build out the system, putting more pipes in the ground, putting more capacity in the treatment, that's where the big costs are going to be. So that's why, I mean, at this juncture, I think it would be very unwise to penalize one class of customers that has been paying for your plant the whole time, so a new class of customers can come in and take advantage at a discounted rate.
Certainly, there's discussion, in the future, participation in the community of what you'd like to see
Craig,
in your community.
could you discuss connection fees, because that's supposed to pick up that issue? Connection fees are what people charge when they hook up to the sewer.
So our general manager spoke to that a little bit.
A little
There's
bit, yeah.
Capacity connection, so a developer comes in and says, want to put in 10 single-family homes or multifamily units, then does our plant have capacity, and then what our connection rates are? So as a district, we could look at that. If we're getting a lot of multifamilies and we need an increased connection fee, that we've had many residents paying into the system, and we think newer residents coming in or newer developments should pay a higher connection fee, then at that time in the future, the board could look at that. But certainly what you're speaking of is something at a city and county level in terms of housing elements, as you mentioned, and the plans for certain areas, the PDAs, and if it's increased density, if the community really wants that, and the sanitary district is just one service that's provided to that, and if that has an impact in the existing residents and homeowners, then that's something to take a look at. But what we're dealing with today is basically adjusting our rates, and as you may know, in the past, with our new finance manager, we found some discrepancies in billings, and I think there's some churches in the past that we had to make adjustments to. So as these things come forward, we are making adjustments, and as the gentleman here mentioned, there's quite a few multifamily owners that have stepped forward and said, we really need to take a look at this. Other parts of Marin taking a look at it. Our engineering group and staff put in quite a bit of time on this.
So just talk a little bit about the capacity piece. So as I mentioned,
Yeah.
new development comes in, they put all the facilities in for the sewer system.
Okay.
Even if there's a pump station, they would pay for that. As far as the treatment plant, they pay capacity fees. So a house would pay $6,200 currently, and if this goes through this way, the multifamily would pay $4,860. That's $4,860 that would go toward future plant expansions and stuff. The other thing to remember is when they build these facilities, they're putting in new sewer pipes. Your pipes, the majority of your pipes are old. And so in a way, they're actually going to be paying for your pipes that we're currently rehabilitating. And we have monies set aside every budget to do that. So we're putting $1.5 million a year just in capacity to fix lines that are out there. And that's just ones that need additional capacity. Then we also have sewer charges for just replacement of our sewer mains that don't need capacity but are falling apart. So in a way, they're actually going to be paying for your stuff, and it's just a different way to look at it. And they're also going to be paying these capacity fees that will go into treatment costs.
Are you talking about rehabilitation on the sewer main that runs in between the homes?
Yes. Yes. As I mentioned, we have 105 miles of sewer pipe, and the majority of it is, how old, Janice, would you say? 55 years old. How many of you have replaced your roof?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. And so, as we've been discussing, there is no perfect answer. You get as close as you can. And we do have new regulations coming down. When the plant was built in 1955, which a lot of the processes are still in service, there was a different type of sewage. Now, when you look at our plant and what comes into our plant, we have wipes, we have medicines, we have all these different things that people throw down the drain that they quote call disposable. Everything is changing, and the regulations have changed. When I started here in 2002, we didn't have a requirement for our sewer system where we had to report sewer spills and this and that and the other. Now we do have to do that. And we have to have plans and maintenance plans, and we have to replace our bad lines. We're mandated by that. If we don't, guess who pays the fines? You guys do. And It's really unfortunate, but if you've been reading the IJ over the
Sure.
last 5 or 6 years, you've seen some of the $1 million fines that have happened. And, you know, the board is committed to replacing lines. We've hired great staff, and we're avoiding these fines that ultimately you guys would have to pay anyhow. So if we had $1 million fine, what would that individually cost each of you? You guys know that, how much? It would cost you guys $49 each for that.
And is that for a multi-unit person too? Or will they get a reduction?
We could get into breaking it down a little bit more, but it's still a lot of money. And, you know, I think that, you know, the board has done an outstanding job. We're all essentially new. All the employees that are here are new. Within the last 2 years, the board, you know, Russ even was relatively new when I started here. But my first years at the district, I spent many nights on the floor of my office because the plant was in such shambles. So one of you asked the question, why was it this low when I started and now it's this high? Well, when I started, they were actually burning on reserves because the sewer fees weren't sufficient to supply the O&M costs and the capital costs. And the facilities were literally falling apart. Through a lot of hard work and many nights spending at the treatment plant, we held it together. But it's 1950, 54. Old facilities, like your roof.
There's also a chart in the back. I'm not sure which one of the 4 charts in the back, but it has a comparison between the district's rates and other local agencies. So you might want to take a look at that and see a comparison.
So,
I'll get to your
Go ahead.
question here. Hold on just a second. I did want to introduce the staff in the back. You met Janice Mandler on the far left. She's our corrections officer. Nina Kapitanis is our lab manager. Mike is our engineer. And we have, I'm sorry. Mel, of course, Mel Liebman is our new plant manager. And Mel's new to us and doing a great job coming in and making good changes. And then Mark talked about all these varying chemicals of interest and things that are coming into the plant. And we have this MPDES permit and constantly new regulations that we're under. And our plant of a certain age needs to be added new technology. And so that this is kind of turning the corner. And last person here is Ray Global with EOA. And Ray works with us on kind of optimizing the best way we could obtain our MPDS. This is the pollution discharge permit, national permit, on a regular basis. So Ray is quite knowledgeable. All the staff, as we mentioned, will be here after we go through this process of informally want to speak to the staff and understand basically what else we're doing. That'll be available. So some of these are pretty standard questions. I wanted to get through those, and then if there's any additional follow-up questions. Before I get back, I know we had a question back. Did you have a question for Mark? Or?
Well, I guess maybe just on what you're talking about, I don't think the issue is necessarily cost, because I think, you know, when we look at it per year, it's not a huge cost, but I think it comes down to more matter of principle. But the question that I had was more, I guess, clarification on the numbers that we're looking at here. So currently, each homeowner or each unit is charged $647 annually. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you're looking at reducing multifamily housing costs to about $540 per unit and increasing single family to $675.
And also commercial.
And commercial. Okay, so I mean, looking at that, if you were to equalize it, make everyone just pay equally, it seems like you would reduce the median between 540 and 675 to $607.50. So that would produce a rate drop for everyone and still produce the same amount of funding. So there just seems to be a huge benefit.
So what you have is disproportionality between the number of residential customers, the number of commercial customers, the billing units, and the amount of revenue that you have decreased the multifamily by. So it's all based upon collecting a specific amount of revenue that's equal to what the district currently receives. We know what the number of units are for the billing units for residential, multifamily, and for the commercial. So I'm not quite sure I understand exactly your concept or your comment, but.
I'm just saying if we were really going for true equity, and if everyone were to be paying the same, that would reduce in a drop from 640 to 607.
So let me, you bring up a really good point, because it's the definition of what's equitable. What's fair or what's equitable? And I had this discussion with the board on the very first day, didn't I?
Yes.
Yes, I did. And so what I said was, let's talk about what those concepts are. What is fair? So you all remember when you were a little kid and your sister or your brother got a bigger slice of the pie, your mom cut a piece off, and you go, well, that's not fair. So what's that all mean? Fairness is a perception. It's not necessarily a proportionality. It's not necessarily an equitable proportion. That's what we're striving for here, is proportionality. So what we're saying is that on a proportional basis, when you look at the flow, what we believe and what the data shows us and what industry data shows us is that there is a greater proportion of flow coming from the single-family residential as from the multifamily.
Wait, but
And
you didn't
Based
say
on
that.
flawed data.
You said the water flow is more.
Well,
You're confusing the two things. This is what.
I meant the
That's all you
wastewater
can
contribution.
use, is water coming in.
The same thing is true. It's based on water consumption, but there is a greater proportion that we believe of wastewater flow that comes from residential versus the multifamily.
That's a much squishier definition.
Squishier?
Well, so that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
But it's based upon proportions of what we think people contribute to the wastewater flows. And that's how we define equitable. It's not a perception of who's more or who's less. It's what is your contribution to the flows of the system.
So my point is without having definitive data, it's not very equitable.
So then your fallback position is everybody should pay the same exact amount.
Which would reduce in a lesser rate
Even
than
though we
everyone's
know-
already. Well, but that baseline would reduce what everyone is paying equally. That would go from everyone paying $647. That would go from everyone paying $647 to $607.50.
No.
And that,
No.
Because you need the same amount of money.
647 is what you're doing right now. Everybody pays the same exact per unit cost. So that's your definition. Your definition of equity is everyone pays the same exact unit cost. My definition of equity is that it's based upon how much you use of the system, how much flow you contribute to the system. So just like when you go to the gas station, if you pump 10 gallons and I pump 8 gallons, should I pay 10 gallons even though I pumped 8 gallons?
I would be fine if there were a definitive measurement. No, but I'm talking about, and we can talk about this further afterwards, but I'm talking about the difference between one section paying 540 and one paying 675, and where's the middle point on that? And that's where I'm getting the 607.
Okay.
So
that really is the crux of the issue here, it seems like, is our definition, each individual's definition of what's fair, what they think is equitable. That's the challenge here of the board, is to understand all that. So, yeah.
If you find out that you're wrong, down the road.
Right.
How soon are you going to revisit this discussion about rates? There are going to be some, we think, unfortunately, major big developments. Nothing, I hope, that's as catastrophic as what happened in Corte Madera, but it could happen. Right. So at what point will you revisit this whole discussion?
So that's a really, really good question. And let me tell you what I tell all my clients, is just like these folks do a budget every year, just like they have an audit every year, they ought to take a look at their rates on an annual basis. Because 99% of the revenue that this utility needs to operate comes from rates. So what that means is, we need to take a look at rates on an annual basis. Susan, when she gets the billings every year, she looks at the consumption data from the water district for that particular year. So this is not an end-all discussion in terms of looking at these ratios and relationships. And as we've talked about, there are certain legal requirements that you establish rates that you think are cost-based, based upon the best available information. So while we're talking about 80%, if something changes over time, if consumption patterns change, that ratio can also change.
So Tom, we have a question
Yeah.
way back, and then it'll be next.
Yeah.
What about these?
Go ahead. That's you, yeah.
Well, it wasn't really a question, it was sort of a comment, and that was, is there anybody in this room that thinks that if the rates for multi-unit buildings goes down, that savings will be passed on to the tenants?
No.
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 I think we have a question here next.
I'd like to know how
That's a great point.
how many single-family homes and how many multi-family?
Yeah, so how many single-family, multifamily customers? What did we come back to?
I think single family, I don't have the exact figures, it's about 6,000 single family homes, and multifamily units, there's about 2,500.
Yeah, so the 30,000, I think, that Mark referred to was the population.
Population.
Right, not units.
Not accounts
Right.
or living units.
And that
Yeah.
could change.
On your graph, you've got about 50% using less than the multi-family ones, and yet you're gonna charge them more. You're giving one group
Yeah.
favoritism and the other group not.
That's what.
Because half of your graphs showed they were way down.
Yeah, so that was the point that was made up here, is if we looked at the multifamily, we'd also see some units above the average, some below the average. So it works both ways. Yeah, but I understand your point.
I have a question, but I have a clarification first. Do I understand it correctly that the reduction for multifamily would be covered completely by single family?
No,
Or would the reduction be covered partially by commercial?
both single family and commercial.
Okay,
Correct.
now, I went and looked at my property tax bill for the last 10 years before I came tonight. And roughly, the first one I had was 2003. Roughly, our bill was going up, our sewer bill was going up 20% a year. And then between 2008 and 09, it went up 57%. What happened that caused that big increase?
Well, as I mentioned, when I started here, the plant was in shambles and falling apart. And we were burning reserves to pay for, instead of raising rates, we were burning the reserves that are there in case of emergencies, instead of raising rates. And so there was already a deficit in 2002 when I started here. The plant was falling apart and we have new regulations. So let me throw some regulations at you. One of them is the plant was designed to blend, meaning that you could take a portion of your wastewater and actually bypass the plant and mix it with treated water, and that was okay. That's not okay anymore. So that's a change. The plant is old, 1955. So we're having, like your roof, you've replaced your roof. You guys told me, some of you. We also are doing things like that. So old pipes, that sort of thing. The other thing is air regulations. Before, there really wasn't a focus on air regulations. Now we have a lot of different generators for pump stations. All those do not meet the new regulations, and so we're having to replace generators. Generators are very expensive, $500,000 and up in some cases. If they're fixed, if they're portable, they're cheaper. So we're dealing with air regulations. And then beyond that, there are just different types of wastewater coming in. As I mentioned, when you go into the store and you buy personal wipes, those personal wipes cause detrimental impacts to the sewer system. They cause sewer overflows and all kinds of problems that way. And then I mentioned the collection system aging, and we actually have new regulations for that, where we have to now clean and video and smoke test. You've seen our flyers, you've probably seen our guys out there. We're doing such a good job that we actually received the State of California Award for the best sewer agency for collection systems in California a few years back. We do that with much less staff than what some of the other sewerage agencies are using for their collection system. So if you were to look at staff versus what we're accomplishing, it's pretty amazing.
You've convinced me that it's worth all the money we're paying, and you've also convinced me nobody should get a break, because they're getting the advantage in having to pay for all that.
What I would say is that if you really want to see what the plant looks like, come out and take a tour. because that will open your eyes. We've had customers come in and they're very upset. Why does this cost so much? But when they see what we're dealing with and how we're improving, they go, wow, you guys are doing a good job and you're really putting up with a lot of stuff.
So I have a statement and I have a question. The statement is, all toilets are created equal.
That's not true. That is not a true statement.
That's not true.
Why, okay, I have a low flow toilet in my house. I press the button, it's 1.6 gallons. If it's in a mobile home, it's still the same 1.6 gallons.
And I just got rid of 2 of them.
Okay,
3 gallons.
what I'm saying is the waste production is similar, and it has nothing to do with the excess.
Actually, it's not.
Well, how would that be?
Well, let's use another example. When you have an apartment complex, they're all using the same sewer pipe, one lateral that goes into a sewer main. You guys have individual houses and so that's a lot more pipeline to serve those houses than that individual condo or apartment.
Homeowners are responsible for that sewer lateral.
Only for the sewer lateral, but not for the sewer lines that run through.
Okay.
So you can get into all kinds of dynamics where you start saying, well, I'm this far away from the plant, and I'm this
Well,
far
okay,
away
but
from
we've also been paying for it for 50 years. But actually, I really wanted to ask this question, and some of my statements have hinted to it. So we have the ABAG, there's the Department of Finance projections for our area that Marin is going to basically grow maybe 1% for the next 10 years. That's the golden standard. However, ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, says that Marin's going to grow by 16%. They have identified all areas between a half mile on each side of the 101 freeway as a priority development area. We don't know where that's going to stand, but my calculations, you're looking at 20,000 units, possibly. What are you doing to, I realize you're where the rubber meets the road and you don't, but what are you guys doing to anticipate those types of changes and prepare for the possibility that this future, which we don't want, comes to pass?
Right, well, it's very difficult because, as you know, there have been a lot of protests for low-income housing.
I was there.
And, you know, it's hard to say how that's shaking out because there are a lot of people that don't want it and there are people that want it.
Well,
and you take a look at Silvera, which is really that last large open space in our district. And, you know, there's been a large fight for not developing that. And so today that hasn't happened. And even St. Vincent's tried to do development and that didn't happen.
well, one's approved, you know.
Right, but at a much smaller amount.
Okay, so really the question, it's kind of a general question. How much? Well, it is the topic.
It is not what if and this and that.
Okay, it's
Sounds like
the
it's a
future.
Capacity question.
It's a capacity. What?
Future capacity question. So that if, say, all this was built out, does the plant have the capacity, or would we need to expand? Is that getting?
Yeah, and not only that, but how? I mean, clearly there's going to be a lot more sewer capacity needed, more plant and everything else. So does this rate structure accommodate that future that some people are talking about?
Here's the issue. The plant already does not have sufficient capacity, and it's not related to how many residents we have and how many people are flushing their toilet, what size toilet they have. The issue is wet weather flow and the problem of old sewers. Our normal summertime flow daily total is around 2.1 to 2.3 million gallons. We've treated 15.1 million gallons in a day due to old pipes. And so that's an issue. We're working on that, you know, but it costs you. So we can fix it faster, but it's all going to cost you. But as I mentioned, the regulations are saying no more blending, no more mixing flows where you treat some of it all the way and some of it you treat with partial. They're not allowing that. So we are going to have to expand our plant to not deal with new people coming online, but we're going to have to deal with the existing problem of infiltration and inflow. There's not sufficient capacity for.
Okay, how far out do you plan?
Can we get these two questions up here answered? They were before yours.
It really is. I'm just finishing up
These
the
questions.
subject.
They came in an hour ago.
let's let it move
You
on.
can discuss that with him. We don't need to know about that.
Well, we'll need to know about it.
Well, actually, yeah, you certainly, everyone's welcome to, or if you have any questions that we didn't address today, feel free to contact staff and we'll try to get those on the website and answered as well. There was a particular question of how come we had these dramatic rate increases, and that's, of course, this is a rate adjustment, so we're not, even though you'll see it as increased, this is something very different. And our attorney talked about the 218 notice. I just want to indicate that if you do look into the detail, a lot of this is all tied back into 218 in terms of what those rates were going towards, what exact capital improvements for the plant is necessary and what they're being spent on. So that information is available, and those of you who help participate with us in the 218 process, we appreciate that, and that information is available as well. Okay, I think we had a question in the back. If it's a brief one, we could take that and then we'll finish these up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Tom, just for clarification from my understanding of this, your research that you were using to come up with the averages for single family or multifamily and such as that, was that from data from the water district?
Yes.
Okay, so you took it for the winter period that you were talking about, you took that data and said, this should be the averages for single family and this should be the averages for multifamily.
Correct. We went through, we sorted the customers into the customer groups. We looked at the data. We had a few customers where there were some issues with the data. We tried to scrub the data clean as best we could. And from that, we created those averages.
Okay.
So you are correct in essence of what you're saying.
Thank you.
Okay, so if this is your question, you'll know. Does your multifamily rate reduction hold true for affordable housing developments? Also, right now, that is the only fee that the owner is paying.
I asked that question already and it was answered. Yeah, that was my question, yeah.
And then this one as well. What happened between the 2008 and 2009?
That was mine too, yeah.
Okay, and a 57% increase, okay? This one is, what did we spend? Actually, let me get to these here because they are, look to be comparable. One says, why would a 3-bedroom apartment produce less sewage than a 3-bedroom home? The determining factor seems to be the number of occupants. Landscape water runs into the ground, swimming pool water evaporates, so where does the single family home produce more sewage? And before you get to that, Tom, let me ask this one as well, so there'll probably be some threads on it. Do apartment dwellers really use less water for toilet sinks and laundry than single family residents, really? Or do the live in buildings that are built lot line to lot line and have, and perhaps we discussed this one already, less landscaping to water? A sewer charge, to be fair, should be the same for single family apartment units. Everyone better, I'm sorry if I'm not reading this all exactly, wash dishes and flush toilets. And that was that question.
I'm not sure if I've answered all those or.
Yes.
I think I probably have, but here's another thing to think about. So there are some multifamily living units where, as an example, there may not be a dishwasher, or it may be no laundry, a good example also. So there certainly can be differences in the characteristics of one living unit from another. There was the question about a 3-bedroom condo versus a 3-bedroom single-family home. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I'm not quite sure what the basis for the question was that said that there was a difference between those two. So
Number of occupants.
So one of the things we didn't try to do was come down to each individual customer and try and figure out, well, how many bedrooms are in this home, or how many toilets, or how many fixture units. Fixture units is one way that some sewer utilities look at rates. So they'll count the number of toilets, they'll count the number of faucets, so on and so forth. Again, administratively, that's one way to do it, but it's not a very good way to do it, because you're sort of into people's homes. You don't want to do that. But also, there's probably a few folks in the audience here. I'm one of those that I have 3 bedrooms and a couple of baths, and it's my wife and I just living at home now. The kids have grown up and they've gone. And so the measurement of the number of fixtures is not necessarily a good surrogate. What we do know is water consumption is probably the best available surrogate that we have for what we think is coming out of the particular living unit.
And winter is the best time because you don't have irrigation.
Well, we can't say absolutely there's no irrigation, but we think it's minimized in that time period.
So I'd still like to get my question answered. How far out are you doing capital, planning out for capital improvements?
We do a 5-year capital budget, and we're at the end of this rate increase. This is the final year. We are looking at the next rate increase or evaluation of where we're headed, not this year, but the following year.
And what do you base your demand statistics on? Do you use the Department of Finance projections for population growth? Is that one of the factors that you use?
Yeah, there's a card up there that I wrote with 3 questions on it. Is that going to get addressed?
I have, that's the last one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your next up. I also wanted to mention, and when you speak to staff offline too, and as board, we're concerned about this as well, is there's new laws coming up, new state laws. One is dual plumbing of new buildings where we could use recycled water. It might not address, high density homes, but it is something that may be an interest of our district, and we'd like to move towards that, particularly since we now have a new plant. We provide recycled water, so that might be the connection between the district, our residents, and someone that might have more of the capacity of creating that, and that would be our cities and counties, and as these developments come in. So that's something I think as a board, we're interested in that new legislation and how we could try to get that into better community. Last one, 3 questions, 3-parter. Susan, what do we spend so far with HDR?
The initial study was $25,000, and we went through a competitive request for proposal process, got about 5 different proposals, and evaluated them for the content and chose them. And then we did have a follow-up study to look at the multifamily issue specifically because it's so complicated since we have so many units. And I believe the proposal for that was $10,000, so about $35,000 in total.
I see you board members, I'm really impressed. You guys are pretty intelligent, really skillful people, and I'm really surprised that we have to spend this kind of money on outside help.
That's because we live in Marin County and that's all they do in the county.
As Tom mentioned, there's an incredible amount of detail and subtlety. And Tom's assistant, Mr. Kroon, if you've been to some of our other meetings, he drilled down into a lot of these areas and answered questions and worked directly with Susan. That's not only MMWD data, but county data too. What is 18 or 21 or 14 and how they are categorized. And I totally understand and get it. That's a clean way would be just a point A to point B meter and measure, but this is not in the industry, at least not yet. And this is what we're dealt with and how to deal with things. So this is where we are now and how we try to optimize and make the best use of this. Second question. Oh. Did the board do a study on HDR to cut costs?
Okay.
You might want to elaborate on that.
Well, I see how we're studying how we can get all us to challenge each other and discuss the minutia of how much they pay, how much I pay, how much water I'm using in my yard, and it really contains the discussion in this little tiny part, and there's just so much more to this. If we said, hey, we always put that much energy into, let's take the public over to the plant and let's look at their books and see how we can save money. It seems like it'd be more that both are very important and they both can be done. And I would love to see a presentation on how the money is spent.
Yeah. We're very interested in effective use of our ratepayers' money. And if you get into our 218 notices and our costs, we have staff that have competitively received grants that haven't necessarily cost you anything other than their staff time, and as well as Mark alluded to, some of our records and awards that were recognized in the industry. So
I know you guys are doing an excellent job. I have no arguments about the quality of work that's going on there.
I think we're with you, and if that word isn't getting out to our newsletters and things, then let us know what else you're interested in, we'll certainly try to.
We can send a copy of the budget out, you know, as much as we see these kind of bar graphs.
Actually, the budget's available on the website as well as our annual financial statements for the last several years. All that data is available.
Excellent, I'll look into that, thank you.
And I just want to say something. We use consultants, so we don't have to hire additional staff. If we were to have additional staff to do the work that we're talking about, it costs you a lot more money. He's an expert in what he does. We're not experts, so we would have to get trained up in that, and that again would cost you money. So it may seem like a lot of money, but in place of hiring a full-time staff member to do what he does, it saves you a lot of money.
One thing on, you keep saying the plant was built in 55?
Yes.
I moved here in 62, and I think it was close to 70. They completely rebuilt that plant, and they had open house.
Yeah.
And the guy was drinking water out of it.
Yeah, he's dead
It was not completely rebuilt because the clarifiers that we just rehabilitated 2 years ago were the original clarifiers. They actually had the original motors on them and the original drives, and the weirs were ready to fall into the actual tank. And a clarifier, if for you guys who don't know, it's floaters and sinkers. That's one of the processes.
But they had a big open house.
Oh, yeah, they did. And they've done a variety of different upgrades, but the permit requirements of the plant have changed. And the other issue that I keep on driving home is the sewer system is leaking a lot of water. And so what it was in 1985 for flow is not the same as it is now. But we are starting to see it gradually start to drop with all the hard work we've been doing.
We also
So
have
I'm just
a recycled water plant too, so the staff you see here, they should all be credited for it.
I'm just trying to like complete the question, and the question is about the planning process. Are you planning off of permits, building permits issued, or how do you anticipate demand for the future?
Well, we anticipate the demand for the future is actually, our growth is basically stagnated. We don't have capacity fees coming in because the last development that we had was 33 San Pablo, and that was, I forget how many units. 80 units, and that was like back in 3 years ago. And so we just don't have any more development in our district. Our district is built out unless they do some of these density.
Well, that's what's going to happen.
And what I keep on telling you is if those come in, that's actually going to save you money because yes, they are lower, but they're going to be paying for your old sewer lines. And they may be paying for some of the treatment plant. They're going to be bringing in capacity fees.
And you won't plan for those until you see approved?
Right, because I've been hearing about this ever since I've got here. Oh, you're going to have this development, or you're going to have that development. Nothing has really transpired.
Right. Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So my concern builds off of what you mentioned, and it connects to the point that, what's your name? Penny. That Penny made, is that my concern is who does this change really benefit? It most likely will not benefit
Apartment owners.
That's all.
Apartment owners or large rental development owners as well. And so it will most likely benefit them the most compared to, and us helping to pay some of that cost. And the benefit won't translate down to the tenant, to the renter. So
that's really hard to quantify that, as far as it's all about equitable, and it's the best that we can do with what we have.
So, Board Member Rushing,
I've heard, thank you all for being here, but I've heard a couple comments that makes it sound like that the break that we would give multifamily houses would somehow advocate development of more multifamily houses in the future. And I just wanted to put to bed the notion that we're advocating that at all.
Yeah.
We're not. And so all we're trying to do is, as Tom has said, we think that multifamily houses have been subsidizing, somewhat, and so we're just trying to make the playing field as fair as possible. So it's an impossible task to do it perfectly, but we're doing it in the most general, easiest way, best way we think we can.
That's right. So we're almost there. We're at the third of 3 questions. It's the last one. So this one is also for Susan and Mark, how much did we spend on administration costs?
I don't know exactly administration costs. Our operating and maintenance budget for last year, or this current fiscal year, is $5.3 million.
On administration or?
No, overall operating and maintenance. We don't have an administration-only budget because we have administration salaries, but we have plant salaries, and some things are office supplies, or those administration, but if a treatment plant guy comes and takes a pen, I don't make him sign it out and say, okay, I'm charging that to your department.
Right, so administration is me, Susan, and Nancy, and we have one other second. That's our administration staff. We're not like stocked up really good. I again encourage you to come and take a tour.
I'll take you up on that, thank you.
Great.
How do we get to go on a tour?
Just call up the district office and I'd love to give you guys a tour.
Oh, okay, great.
There's also 3.5 miles of trails out there.
Yeah. Oh, you walk out there all the
Yeah.
time.
And board member Robbie Elias is on our Hamilton Trail connection, try to get connected to new trails.
Make it work more.
And he has another.
My comment's off topic, but I hope that none of these upgrades and improvements that you're talking about would result in elimination of those ponds out by the sewage treatment plant today.
No.
Good call.
Because that's one of the prime tourist attractions around.
One of the nicer attractions.
I always take them to look at the sewage treatment ponds, and they all look at me like I'm nuts. And we go out there, and they come back flabbergasted.
Well, I know I speak for the rest of the board, and we really appreciate you coming out. And I know this is, the sewage industry is not really a big special interest, but we see people when they're big things like rate increases but it really is truly a credit to our staff that we're not in the papers without fines and without issues regarding the management. So, as a board, we really do pay a lot of credit to our staff. So, and you're lucky to have these staff serving our district. They've done good things. And so the new hires that Mark has done for us is, we're looking forward to working with some of the new staff as well.
I have another question about something else. Somebody in our neighborhood got a notice that the street is going to be repaved. And so now there's going to be a charge, I assume, by the city if a street needs, not by you.
So this
I'm
was
gonna let Janice talk about this.
Okay.
And our collections manager, because of one of the streets I was on, I received this notice from the city of San Rafael, and there's no indication that our district even related to the sanitary sewers, which was just amazing. So we put our ace on it, Janice Mandler. Janice, you can come forward and deal with this, correct?
Carol, are you in City of San Rafael?
Yeah.
Great to see y'all. Thanks for coming out.
Yes, come on forward.
This paving situation is one of my pet peeves. Necessary, I guess, but the county and the city are now forcing people to pave. If you dig a little hole in the street, like you're gonna reconnect your lateral, used to be it was a little spot repair. Now you have to pave from the curb to the other side of the street curb, and I believe it's 20 feet on each side. This particularly hurts me because I have a budget, and when we replace lines, repair them, we're really getting hit with a lot of paving costs right off the top of my budget. So I feel your pain, but there's nothing we can do about it.
How much is that amount?
It varies. I mean, for us, this amount, I don't know that we've figured out with this current project.
It just depends on the project, and where we're at. And we try to, maybe just to include a little more information. So the city and the county are saying two things. They're saying if we repave the road and you go within our road that we just repaved, within 5 years, you have to do what Janice just said. The other thing is, if the road is in such poor condition, and they have an index, I think it's 70%. If it's in such poor condition and you go do that, you have to do the same thing. What they're saying is when you do that, you cut the old asphalt and it falls apart, and then it makes it even worse than it already is. And to be honest, I've been around our district a lot, and I've seen roads that are atrocious. And it's unfortunate that they're actually pushing these costs onto the district and the ratepayers instead of actually doing it their own. And so I would encourage you actually to write letters and complain about it, because it's a very unfortunate way to shift costs onto the ratepayers.
And to answer your original question, they did send a letter out to everybody, and then we sent a letter to you all. You should be getting that any day, if you haven't done it today, trying to explain what the situation is, and also letting you know about our lateral assistance program, that we can assist you with replacing your lateral, and that would include the cost of paving as well. So that's all on our website. I encourage you to go and take a look at that and see if it would assist you.
And if you have a lateral that is in poor condition and you get one of these letters, it would behoove you to try to get that lateral replaced before they do their asphalt work, because it will save you money. And we do have a program where you can be forwarded money to pay for that lateral, and it will be billed on your property tax bill at 2%, correct?
Yes.
Up to $10,000. So it's a big money saver for you. If you wait and they repave it and you get in a situation where you can't flush your toilets, it's going to cost you a lot of money.
How would you know that your lateral needs?
Well, if you've had situations where you've had to have your plumber come out and you've had it clean, or you have problems with flushing, or you notice there's sometimes where it doesn't flow right, you can have a plumber come out and do an inspection of your lateral with a camera. And when they do that, they can tell and assess the condition of your lateral. And just make sure you request a recording of that, because if it is in poor condition, that's part of our process is we need to see a video of your lateral.
Are your trucks still, after they had that big flap several years ago about where the real estate agents were against because you had to have your lateral inspected before you sold your house, after that, you had trucks going out. Do you still have trucks going out and doing cameras?
We camera the sewer main and we look up the laterals, and if we see an issue with a lateral, we will send out a letter, correct, Janice?
We normally leave a door hanger,
Right.
saying that we noted roots coming from
And
your
so you're checking the main sewer main in the street, and then are you checking the lines to our houses?
No, we look up them slightly, but no, not from your house all the way. That's a whole different camera.
Okay,
Much smaller.
okay.
What we usually do is when we're doing any work on the street, and it's just something that we've acquired over the years, we thought it was the right thing to do. The streets are dug up anyway. We give people notice that we're doing that and get them a good rate on having their sewer laterals done at the same time.
We actually pay for their lower lateral to be done.
Yeah.
During the project.
And a lower lateral is?
Typically, from the sidewalk, the property line, to the middle of the street where it connects to our main line.
Okay. When I saw the guy out there, I went out there, and he let me go in and look and see how this looked.
Go in where, the manhole?
No, in the truck, and see the television camera, and then I got all upset because he says, this is coming from your house, and I said, but I'm not there, there's water pouring out, and it turned out my washing machine was on. It was really interesting.
I just have one comment. I want to thank each and every one of you citizens that are serving on the board, and of course the staff, but particularly the citizens, because you're our eyes and ears, and you know, things go to hell if nobody's watching. So I appreciate that. So I voted for 3 of you. The other 2 I didn't know about.
So what Janice was talking about was the street cut moratorium, and none of our residents should feel pressured, but there is an urgency. The city does control the streets. We do have the lateral assistance program. If any of your neighbors feel like, hey, I think a lot of folks wait till the last moment, could be a weekend where things are backing up into a shower or something like this, they call a plumber, then they feel the squeeze. The plumber says you need to do this, this, and this, you don't get and that shouldn't happen. Now, district does have a list of plumbers, and the city I work for has a list of plumbers that I've shared as well, and some of those folks come over into the North Bay as well. So we certainly recommend that you get multiple bids. And then in regards to our sewer lateral program, Mark had indicated you need the filming of the line to show that you do have intrusions or issues with it. So there's a before and after that's needed as part of obtaining that grant. And there's certain paperwork you can contact Susan at the administration or at the plant.
I just want to comment that we do have an outstanding staff and board, and this has been a really tough process for us. And I hope you understand that it's very difficult to raise rates. I live over in Fairfield, and the residents in the area I live, they're paying $300 every 2 months for their water bill, regardless if they use any water or not. So I'm very aware of the impact, but we do have a great staff, and you guys as customers are very fortunate to have a great board and staff that are engaged and really care about the environment and our customers. So.
And great customers.
And we have great customers that are engaging us. We appreciate you coming out.
No, and really we do, because otherwise, you need to be the eyes and ears. You need to watch your boards. That's the truth of the matter.
So with that, thank you, Megan. With that, I'd like to formally close our public workshop.
Love's fast.
Meet with staff, our consultants, and there's brochures and information in the back. And grab some of our staff cards